So in this video, I'm going to talk you through the criminal topic. Let's put it on full screen. So this is paper one as well. So key concepts that you need to know are what a crime is. So it's an act which breaks the law of the land that's punishable by law and can vary across time and culture. We need to know the 5 types of crime. So sexual, violent, antisocial, drug-related, and acquisitive. A lot of people forget about acquisitive. That's just like acquiring things. So like theft, for example. Also, when they ask you to define a type of crime, they don't want the actual example of the crime, like rape, murder, graffiti. They want the actual name of it. But then on some questions, they do ask you for an example of them. So you've got to be careful and read the question. They also like to ask you about crime being a social construct. So whenever you get a question about crime changing depending on culture or place or age, it's talking about crime as a social construct, so being created by society, and it's being created by social norms. So you've got to put social norms in your answer. So, for example, a good one to remember is drug use, because in the Netherlands, so in Amsterdam, you can smoke cannabis. That's legal, but in the UK, can't do that. So if you get a question, it usually is define what it means by social construct, so different laws in different places because they're deemed by social norms. So you've got to put that in your answer, social norms, and then you've got to put what it's like in one country compared to what it's like in another one. Homosexuality is another one, legal in the UK, illegal in places like Saudi Arabia. So think about that kind of grid that we did in class, that you want to be using a couple of examples, and it can be across time or it can be across cultures. So obviously, abortion used to be illegal in the UK, but it's now legal. Although, you could do that as a cultural one as well, because places in America, but you need specific examples. So just pick an easy one. The drug one's like a nice one. And then the opposite of it being a social construct is that it's objectively unacceptable. Everybody agrees in every culture and at every time point that these things are not okay. So, for example, when somebody murders somebody else, people deem that to be a crime everywhere. Like there isn't a culture that goes, oh no, that's all right. So, everyone is agreeing that murder is something which is objectively unacceptable. We shouldn't be doing that to others. Another key concept is how we measure crime and the strengths and weaknesses of that. So the first one is official statistic. These are based on reported crimes to the police, and the Home Office publishes these findings. So they are a bit out of date by the time they get published. So like you don't know the crime stats until like a year or two later. Um, and a massive problem with trying to measure crime with these is that lots of crimes go unreported. Lots of people don't report them because it's quite difficult to report a crime. And obviously, if you're a victim, you might not feel very comfortable reporting a crime. So oftentimes there's the dark figure of crime, which is the ones that are all underreported. So we can't actually tell how bad crime is really. But then a positive is that because they're in numbers and they're quantified, very easy to analyse, compare, and all that kind of stuff because it's objective. No interpretation required. And then we've got the other one, which is surveys, which are basically questionnaires. And in the exam, you can put either questionnaire or survey for criminal topic. They accept them equally. And you can either give them to a victim and ask them to try and kind of say what the crime was that they experienced, or give it to a criminal that's actually conducted the crime. Now, both of these allow you to see crimes that have not been reported. So it tells you that dark figure of crime. And the negative for it is we've got with the victim some ethical issues because of protection from harm. They might not want to relive that experience. And for a criminal, they might show social desirability bias. So they might lie to make themselves look good. So they might kind of say, oh no, I haven't done as many crimes. And there's a bit of an issue, like those criminal surveys have got to be anonymous. Otherwise, criminals are probably not going to admit to it because they don't want to go to prison. So they don't want any consequence. Now, the first theory that you need to know in crime is social learning theory, which is a nurture theory. So one of the debates that they usually ask a lot about on the criminal topic is nature nurture. So that might be what they ask about in the 30 marker, but they have already asked that in the past. So it's unlikely that they'll ask about that again. But if they ask about it in a different topic, then you can use the social learning theory as nurture and Isaac as nature. So you can still use it if it comes up again. So we need support that social learning theory is observing and imitating a criminal role model. If you see that the role model is rewarded by obtaining goods through their criminal acts, then you're vicariously reinforced to want to be a criminal. And then when you do the crime, so you've imitated it and you get rewarded with the goods, you're positively reinforced. And then you're more likely to do that in the future because it's been internalized. Now, there's a couple of words that are not on here that you might need. So you identify with a criminal role model. So that means you think they're like you. So same gender, for example. And then when you've internalized it, that's become part of your normal behavior. So you don't need to be reinforced anymore. You just kind of like you've learned how to pickpocket or whatever it is. So if you remember that hero question that we had a go at, they wanted to know identification and internalization because those are the two that people either don't know or they forget about. And probably because when you're doing a summary of social learning theory, they're not always the ones that are kind of taught as well. So they kind of like to ask questions about those too. Now, a criticism of social learning theory is that, if we're learning our behaviour from a criminal role model, well, then where did the first criminal learn it from? Because they're the first, so it doesn't make sense. Maybe there's more of like a nature explanation, like a criminal gene or whatever, which is what the second point says, which is very reductionist to just look at the nature explanation. So observe and imitation of criminal role model. Not everybody that has a criminal in their family, for example, imitates their behaviour, but I suppose social learning theory would say that they've not identified with them, and that's why. But maybe there's like, for example, a criminal gene, or maybe there's the Eysenck stuff that explains it a little bit better. Maybe it's a mixture of the two. So it's quite reductionist to just say that it's social learning theory and nurture. And then the study that kind of supports social learning theory is Cooper and Mackey, looking at whether violent video games will have an impact on children, particularly if there's any differences between gender. So they've predicted in their hypothesis that an aggressive video game will impact the behaviour more than non-aggressive, and that boys and girls will view them differently. We've got 84 children, so relatively okay sample, not too bad. It's quite representative in terms of the fact it's 84. We've got a certain age range, so we've got age bias. It's in New Jersey, so we've got culture bias. And then we've got children being paired up. And then we've got informed consent from the children. And we've got a lab experiment, very controlled. We've got 3 games that they're playing. So we've got the high aggression, which is Missile Command, like a shooting game. We've got low aggression, which is Pac-Man, which you can play Pac-Man on Google if you're interested. If you type it into Google, you can play it. And then we've got just drawing a paper maze as a control. So that's not an aggressive game at all. Like it's not low or high aggression, it's just a control. And then we've got the second IV, which is why they're paired up, of whether they play the game or whether they watch the game being played. So we've got an independent measure design because they've only got one of those games, but we've got a repeated measure design because they both play and observe, so they switch over afterwards. So they're randomly allocated to one of the games, so we haven't got any research bias. They play the game for 8 minutes whilst the other person observes, and the experimenter records the score on the game. So we've got quantitative data. And then once they've played the game, then they get sent to a room, a toy room, and they get to play with whatever toys. So we've got an active toy, which is a basketball hoop, a skill, which is a pinball, an aggressive game, which is a dart gun, and we've got a quiet toy, which is a building blocks. And then we've got sometimes they call it like a Nerf gun as well, actually, for the aggressive toy. And there was actually a question I was just thinking of that came up on the toys, and they'd kind of done it in a really weird way where they'd mixed a few together. So just try and pick the one that fits the best, if you will, because sometimes it's not exactly like that. So it might be worth having a look at some past paper questions on the type of toys because they're slightly different on what they've been asked to what we've actually been told to teach you. So that's a bit frustrating, but have a look at those questions. And then the experimenter is recording which toy they play with and how long they play with it for. And then the observers completed a questionnaire about whether they'd punish a child that was naughty, whether they'd reward a child that was good, to see if they'd do any aggression towards others, which is what interpersonal aggression stands for. And then they also will press a buzzer for the level of punishment when they're being asked about that. And then they swap over and then they do the same process again. And it's been counterbalanced as to which one observes and plays and things like that. So the results, those that played with the most aggressive game, Missile Command, showed more aggression when they were playing with the toys. They were more likely to play with the dart gun, the Nerf gun, than the building blocks, for example. And this affected girls more than boys. So girls were found to be more aggressive than boys, perhaps because of societal expectations about the way boys and girls behave. There was no effect on interpersonal scores, so it didn't affect how children would be aggressive towards others. So it was just in their actual behaviour with the toys. However, it was higher if they played it rather than observing it. So these games where you the actual player in it rather than watching a player doing it, which is what they used to be like. It's got a name, that hasn't it? I can't remember what it's called. That affects aggression more. So that might explain why video games are having more of an impact on aggression than they used to, because you're the actual real like player in it. And so essentially, it does have an impact. We are socially learning our aggression from observing and imitating the violent video game. That's the idea. Obviously, you haven't got a role model in these violent video games, but it's still showing that you can socially learn by observing and imitating, even in the absence of a role model. So it's even worse than what social learning theory suggested in the first place. And then some strengths of this, we're in a lab, high control, we standardised it, means we can replicate it and it's reliable. We can also establish causality, which makes it more valid. There's no gender bias because we've got girls and boys, so they're representative of everybody. And how violent video games will affect people's aggressions. You've got to put these points into context. We've got age bias and culture bias, mention where they're from and what age they are, makes it unrepresentative, can't generalise it to explain how these video games would affect everybody, particularly in non-Western countries. You know, it might be worse there because we might be a little bit desensitized. And then it's very artificial. You're playing a game in a controlled setting. That might not be how children really are aggressive. They might have thought, oh, I'm being watched in this room. I'll not play as aggressively as I would if I was on my own, for example. So it might lack ecological validity. It might not be really how people, you know, observe and imitate aggressive behaviour. And also, this is about aggressive behaviour. It doesn't really explain any other types of behaviour about whether social learning theory is accurate or not. And then we've got theory two, which is on the nature side, and this is Isaac's criminal personality theory. And the idea is that you are a criminal because of your genes, and it's determined by your nervous system, so your body, and kind of how that is behaving. And for Isaac, the suggestion is that in order to be a criminal, you've got to have a high extroversion, be very outgoing, very high in neuroticism, very anxious, and very psychotic. So high in psychoticism, very impulsive, very aggressive, don't really care about others, no empathy. So for extroverts, the bit of the body that explains why they are more likely to be a criminal is that their central nervous system, so central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. So the brain is underactive due to the reticular activating system, the RAS. And that means that because it's restricted, extroverts don't have as much stimulation, so they need more stimulation from their environment, so they need to commit a crime to get that stimulation. They also have a stronger dopamine reward system, so every time they do a crime they find it really thrilling because dopamine makes us like think that it's good, makes us want to do it again. So because they've got a stronger system, they're getting rewarded more, they feel that reward more than what somebody who is an introvert would. So that explains why they're more likely to be a criminal. For neuroticism, they've got an over-aroused, overactive. So we've got an underactive central nervous system for extroverts. For neurotics, so neuroticism, we've got over-aroused autonomic nervous system. This is why it leads to violent behaviour. If you're overloaded with like emotion, so your autonomic nervous system is like you're not really in control of it as much. It's like an automatic kind of response. And it could be like a limbic system and things like that. It's over aroused, so you don't really think through what you're doing. Like think of like your central nervous system as your brain, your spinal cord. In fact, maybe that's confusing. Let me just Google autonomic nervous system just to see if there's autonomic nervous system, if there's anything else that can help us with that. Let's see what it says. Yeah, so this one is basically your fight flight response. That's probably an easy way to remember it. And so you are more aroused to run away, to fight, to be aggressive, to be violent. So it would make sense that if you had a high level of that neuroticism, that you are going to find it really difficult to suppress that, and therefore you'll be more likely to be a criminal because you'll be violent, things like murder and stuff like that. For psychoticism, they've got more dopamine, very similar to the extroverts. So they're more kind of getting rewards from doing criminal behavior. And the difference with psychoticism is they don't have prefrontal cortex to tell them to stop. I mean, they have one, but it's underactive, to tell them to stop doing the criminal behavior, to think about the consequences. They don't really have that activation in their brain. So again, for psychoticism, it's the dopamine. And for both the psychoticism and I think it's the neuroticism, they don't learn from socialization, so they don't learn from their mistakes. So, oh, sorry, no, it's extroverts and neuroticism. They're quite difficult to condition and learn from what's right and wrong because the neurotics are too overstimulated by things, and then the extroverts, have got that difficulty with that dopamine, perhaps. And then some criticisms then. So it's ignoring individual differences. Not all criminals are high in those three traits. Not all crimes are committed by the same types of people. And as well, it's ignoring the suggestion that different crimes might have different people that commit them, for example. So therefore, not very kind of representative of everybody, not very valid. And then it's also very deterministic. It's saying that you will be a criminal if you've got high in these three traits, if your body is like this. But actually, you might have a high dopamine level, but be able to make the right choices and not be a criminal. So it's kind of ignoring that. And also, you might decide to go into business and politics instead. So people that are high in psychoticism, for example, are very good CEOs because they don't really care about people. So they'll make decisions that benefit the company rather than the workers. And so they might go into that rather than committing crime. So it doesn't mean that you're a criminal just because you've got these things in your body. And the piece of research which supports this is heaven. And everyone forgets about heaven and they like to ask questions about heaven for that reason. And it's about delinquency. So delinquency is like small scale crime with like people that are younger. So we're trying to test to see if people that are high in psychoticism, extroversion, and then they view self-esteem, it's a bit easier to measure than neuroticism, but it is part of neuroticism. See whether that impacts your delinquency. And they've done it over 2 years. So we've got 282 adolescents, really good sample size. They're aged 13 to 15, not ideal because we've got age bias. And they're from two Catholic schools in New South Wales and Australia. So again, we've got culture bias, they're from Australia. We've got a longitudinal self-report. So longitudinal, they've done it over 2 years, self-report, this questionnaire. And on this questionnaire, they're asking lots of different things. So they're asking about the self-esteem on a 10 item. So it just basically means 10 questions on self-esteem to test the neuroticism. They are asking, have they been delinquent? Have they vandalized? Have they stolen things? Have they assaulted someone, etc. And this is on a 4-point rating scale: one for never, four for often. So we're getting a lot of like quantitative data from this. Eysenck's psychoticism and extroversion were also measured. And then they've completed it at time point one and time point two, so after 2 years. And then at time point two, 80% of them have responded. So we've got a few people dropping out, which suggests that it's ethical, they've got a right to withdraw. But then that's got an issue with our sample because it's a bit less representative than what it was originally. But it's still pretty good at 80%. And it's also anonymous, so we haven't got any issues with social desirability bias and maybe not wanting to admit that you've been delinquent because there might be consequences because it's anonymous. So confidentiality has been maintained, so quite ethical. And the results are that males are more likely to engage in delinquency than females, but you have to add to this at time point one and time point two. So on the mark schemes, it always says you've got to put 2 time points on. We've also got that psychoticism was the biggest predictor of delinquency at both time point one and time point two, so that needs to be on there. All the other measures were not significant, which supports Isaac in some ways because it suggests that psychoticism does have a prediction, but it doesn't support Isaac in terms of extroversion and neuroticism because the findings did not support that. So the best predictor is psychoticism. So some strengths, it's standardized. We've got a questionnaire, same questions every time. We can replicate that, really reliable. No gender bias, very representative. We've got both genders. However, they're all from Australia. We've got that cultural bias there, not representative of anybody else. Maybe delinquency in other places, in other countries is different. So not very valid, lacks population validity. And then we've got perhaps, now this one, I probably wouldn't use this one because you can say the social desirability bias because they might want to look good and not report the delinquency, but it's anonymous, so why would they do that? So it's probably not likely that one, but if you're stuck, you can still get some marks for saying it. Just trying to think if there's any other weaknesses that you could do. What did we say before? We could also talk about age bias. We can talk about the fact that there's a lot of quantitative data, there's not a lot of qualitative data. We don't know the reasons why they've been delinquent, for example. It could be that there's other things like their peers or their parents or things like that, the way that they're disciplined. So maybe less valid for that reason. And then we've got real world applications. So we need to use our kind of information of how we could use it positively in the real world. So we can punish people, because remember our applications, we're trying to reduce crime. So we can have prisons by locking people away, which means obviously don't write locking people away in your exam. Write something like, I mean, you could say locking them in a prison, taking away their freedom. That's probably a good one to put. A bit more. Look at the definition in your booklets. It's a bit better than that one. You could fine them, so take money away from them. And then we've got community sentencing, sometimes called community service, which is where you help the community with unpaid work like removing graffiti, litter picking, things like that. All of these act as a deterrent, therefore they reduce crime. So when you suggest these, you usually suggest it, put it into context of the scenario, and then specifically say how they reduce crime. So they act as a deterrent. You don't want those things to happen to you as a consequence, so therefore you don't do them in the future. And then the other application is rehabilitation. So this is where you are trying to change someone's behaviour to encourage pro-social behaviour, so where you're nice to people, like we learned about in social influence, rather than committing the crime. So again, you've got to specify how it reduces the crime. So the options that you've got are restorative justice, which is where the victim meets the criminal, they talk about the crime, the victim shares how it made them feel so that the criminal understands the consequences of that. And they can either give the money back, they can apologise. It's been found to be very effective both for the victim and the criminal. And then we've got positive role models. Now, you do need to put the things that are in blue because they're the terminology. And for a positive role model, you'd need to say they'd have to observe a role model that was acting in a pro-social way so that they could observe and imitate that behaviour. So, for example, if they see the behaviour being rewarded, so for example, getting trained in a job, then they're vicariously reinforced. They might identify with a particular mentor, someone who might be like an ex-offender or somebody like that who's turned their life around. You can also help them with things like social skills and anger management, but you don't really want to talk about that because the key things that you get in your marks for is that observation and imitation of a role model and an example of a pro-social behaviour. So hopefully that was helpful. And as you can see, the reason why we love criminal is because it's a nice and easy topic, isn't it? It's really quite straightforward compared to the other ones. But I hope that was helpful. And if you've got any questions, as always, let me know. The questions are also on Teams past exam questions. I have a go at a few, particularly the social construct one, the Isaac ones, the Heaven ones. They're usually the ones that people lose marks, and actually that application one as well.